a few questions for you.
Okay.
Great. So, just for how we plan to take this conversation forward, the whole point of this is to introduce BAS students to just how much potential the interdisciplinary nature of their degree has. And obviously, Paul's work in politics and climate policy is very BASy. So, we're going to talk about his journey as an academic. So, why did you become an academic?
That is such a great question. And I did have a little think beforehand about the kind of things you might ask me. And then the realization hits you. Why did I become an academic? Because this is what's so strange about these things. It was so step by step. Started out doing an undergrad degree, loved it, but then I thought, oh, I could be a bit more specific here. So my undergrad was in international politics with politics. And I do wish a bit that I'd made it more interdisciplinary, actually, because in first year I started out doing French with politics for the year with a couple of modules, one in sociology, one in philosophy. And I learned such a lot from that. But nevertheless, if I'd been able to carry that on a bit longer, that would have really helped with some of the ideas that I've seen later on. As it was, though, I just focused more and more on the international politics bits. And it's only been later on that I've branched out. So I did my undergrad degree, loved it, but then I still felt I could have focused some more in certain areas, both in terms of specialisms, but also I loved being involved in societies. I loved everything to do with being an undergrad and the breadth that that provided. And I did kind of think to myself, you know what, maybe if I do a master's, I'll sink my teeth into a bit more detail. And I did do that a bit more during the master's. And then as soon as I was on that master's course, it did feel quite different to being an undergrad. It did feel like I was in this community of scholars where everyone's done all this really detailed reading, got all these different perspectives, and they're trying to come up with what do they genuinely think about the world going forward. And I think sometimes as an undergrad, it's a little bit trickier to work out what exactly you are thinking about these things, because there's so many new ideas. And whereas in the masters, I was really able to focus. And then by the halfway through the masters, I thought, well, I've got to try and do a PhD if I can. And that's what then led me on this journey ever since.
I think grad school is like, at least for me, it sounds like a really intimidating concept because there's so many, you don't really know where to begin. Like as an undergrad, you feel like you barely know anything about politics, and then you're expected to write like this huge PhD thesis about it. And making that jump is a lot. So what do you think, what are the problems that you faced while applying to grad school? So for example, for me, I feel like coming from like nobody in my family has ever studied a social science. I don't know anybody who has a PhD. I like everyone in my family is a banker. So to me, grad school is essentially, I know nothing about it. I don't have the confidence to apply because I have no I don't know how to go about it. I wouldn't know where to start. So what's some advice that you would give to people considering grad school? And what's some challenges you face?
Well, it sounds like we've had some overlapping backgrounds there, because I certainly didn't know anyone who'd done a PhD or anything remotely similar to what I was doing. And that does create some challenges when you're talking to family about what you're doing and why, because I'm very lucky. My family has always been super supportive, but it's not a path that they've got familiarity with. And so there's a lot of asking around. And so we should definitely have a meeting, by the way, Ananya, just to talk through grad school, if that's something you're thinking of. We can definitely do that over Zoom at some point soon. But certainly for me, it was a lot of fact finding. It was a lot of how on earth am I going to pay for this thing? Yeah. Student fees had just been introduced. That was the first year of £3,000 fees. And at that point, that seemed like quite a lot. And of course, it's higher now, particularly if you're an international student. So one of the first steps was to try and work out what kind of funding arrangements there were. And there are scholarships that exist that will pay for the fees for the masters. They're really rare. You often require quite high marks beforehand, etc. But I was very fortunate to get a scholarship. So I owe Leeds University such a lot for giving me a scholarship that paid for my fees and gave me a grant to live off. And it really made a huge difference. So there are scholarships out there. They are competitive. But I remember thinking to myself, well, I've got to give it a go. And then I'll see where it goes from there. And then that's what worked out for me. But there was a bit at the start you were saying about it being kind of intimidating. And what I would say is I didn't feel that so much with the masters, because what's a key thing to remember, particularly in the social sciences, is often people have come from quite different backgrounds. So in my politics masters, there were people who'd done English Lit, there was a couple of people who'd done biology, there were people who'd done history and languages, and so they brought really interesting dimensions, and they didn't know some of the core concepts I knew, but I didn't have the breadth that they had. And so it kind of created this nice level playing field that then throughout the term, sure, there's plenty of reading, but by the end of third year, the amount of reading that you're doing for your undergrad degree isn't hugely different from your master's. So I do think I would park being intimidated by the idea of it. I would ask myself, do I really want to do this? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's time to start thinking about whether there's funding opportunities or how you go about paying for it.
I think the point about breadth and depth is very interesting, because I do anthropology as one of my BAS majors, but I have a lot of straight anthro friends. And I remember we were doing a group project about medical anthropology, and that's one of my really interest areas. I love the idea of pregnancy and maternal health. And because of BAS, I got to take a lot of optional modules in philosophy, but I also, because of the amount of optionals I get, I also took 2 healthcare modules. And I realized that when we were doing, but I didn't take anthro theory, which is a pretty core concept in anthropology. So I've taken no anthro theory classes. And when we were doing the project, I realized that while I didn't have a very strong theoretical grounding in the more academic side of anthropology, the global health classes and the biology classes actually gave me a certain perspective to approaching those women's health problems. That anthro theory is great and necessary, but I feel like that has its own benefits too. And as an undergrad, I felt like that perspective, I'd never studied life sciences at high school. I only did 3 all social science A levels. So the chance to take those healthcare modules was very new for me, a challenge, but it helped me with anthropology in unexpected ways. And it gives you more depth when you're approaching medical anthropology. And I think linking that to what you study, so climate, obviously there's a lot of environmental scientists out there, there's economists out there. So where do you posit yourself as a politics researcher? And do you feel like politics is for example, in the nicest way possible, and I'm a politics major too, so I think I'm allowed to say this, I think politics takes a backseat when it comes to policy, and economics and science is increasingly coming to the forefront. So how do you sort of, take all that in and, put out good research?
Gosh, well, certainly in terms of how I position myself, when you were asking, you said, are you a political specialist? And the thing is, it's difficult to know whether I'm a political scientist. There isn't really often a phrase for people who do politics, because a lot of us in politics actually dispute the idea that it's a science per se, and that's a whole other conversation that we can do in another video. But what's great about climate change is that it is interdisciplinary. It needs to have that gender politics dimension, like you were just mentioning in terms of women's reproductive health, because there is no climate justice without gender justice. It's as simple as that. But we wouldn't know what justice was if it wasn't for philosophy spending so much time working out, well, what is justice? I mean, is it every person on Earth is entitled to the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions, or is it every country on Earth? Or maybe every actor isn't allowed to have the same amount. And so climate change is an inherently interdisciplinary subject. And that's really exciting, but gosh, it's daunting, because I did biology A level, but I haven't studied sciences since then. And we're relying on each other to say, well, this is the latest research on the science. Now, here you go, economics people, how's this going to be paid for? Okay, well, here you go, politics people, what are going to be the stumbling blocks? Okay, philosophers and critical theorists, who's being missed out here and why does this matter? And so I love that, but it does make it a bit daunting sometimes. And in terms of my research, one of the things that I'm specializing in is complexity. So what we're actually saying is it's a really complex problem, And we need to embrace the complexity. We need to look at all the levels. So it's local government, it's national government, it's the EU, it's the United Nations. It's not just state actors, it's businesses and charities and religious groups, and trying to find out ways to map how they all fit together. Well, it's very difficult, to be honest. It's keeping me busy. But certainly I do love that. And that's why I'm so pleased that Manchester has BAS, and why it's so great that so many of you are doing it, because you are getting some of that breadth and some of those insights that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. I mean, do you start to see yourself, you mentioned going to grad school, do you think you're getting a picture now of where you might go, or are you still exploring the modules?
I think I'd never considered healthcare before, but I'm really interested in, like, I do politics and anthro, and I take a lot of other modules. And I think I'm considering things like public health, global health, maybe even law school. So I'm definitely looking at something more. I did a research internship, and then I did a management consulting internship, so very different. And I realized I enjoyed the real world, quote unquote, real world aspect more. So I enjoyed being able to be on ground and, actually doing the logistics, operational side of what I'm thinking about. So there's a lot of value for research, but I feel like there's not that many avenues to explore it. But compared to, say, so many banks and management consultancies and think tanks that where you can actually go and get experience. Mm-hmm. So I feel like grad school is too gate kept for me to seriously consider it, if that makes sense. And on the other hand, I think I would enjoy something more practical. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another thing I'd love to ask, that climate policy is obviously something, especially given how urgent it is, very action oriented. And mm-hmm. Do you feel like the policy suggestions that you put out in your work, do you see a lag in time response, or do you see a response? Like, I'm not sure how it works. Like, do you put out a paper and then do politicians read it?
I'm going to tell myself they all read it avidly. I mean, prime ministers queue around the block, desperate to read my papers. Is my personal understanding of the situation. But what I think is maybe a more honest depiction of the situation is, the research is slow sometimes, absolutely, and some papers will take several years to work on, and particularly early on in your career when you're still getting familiar with the process and you're wanting to be as good as possible when you're unfamiliar with what it means to publish. But over time, once you've created a bank of publications that make you quite specialized in a certain area, that's when certain policy makers might start to say, oh, actually, we'd love to have a conversation here with you about how X or Y affects people, or some of the best ways to deal with a certain issue. And that's where we start to have a bit more rapid conversations. Or at the moment, for example, I'm liaising with an organisation in terms of advising that actor on their climate policy. And we're doing a 1 to 2 sides A4 brief, basically explaining the situation, why it matters, what needs to be done next, and ways that they could get involved. And that's a very different set of skills to writing a 30-page journal article that takes ages. And that's one of the difficulties, because understandably, people don't have time to read academics' 30-page pieces. And often it will have more detail than they need. And so it's up to an academic to translate these things sometimes. But that's a really difficult skill, and it requires quite a lot of training. And you were touching upon the idea of why did I become an academic at the start with your first question. And I think for me, that's one of the joys of the job. I love the fact that I've been working with some really good colleagues recently who I'm good friends with as well on aviation and climate policy, one of those really difficult issues that is going to be really hard to address, because lots of people need to travel around the world and see family all over the place. But equally, it's one of the few sectors where emissions have gone up and up and up over time. So I've really enjoyed working on that paper. It's been over the course of the last year or so. But simultaneously, I get to be involved in policy making. I get to speak to journalists. I get to teach. And I get to present at certain events and organize conferences. And that's busy and exhausting, and sometimes can be too much. But equally, that's the joy of it as well, because it's broad. And when I was thinking about what jobs to do as an undergrad, there weren't many things where I thought to myself, you know what, I would be doing a very broad job all the time. And whereas academia does give you that to a large degree. Sure, it's quite concentrated during term time. There's lots of non-stop teaching, but throughout the course of the year, that's when you see the bigger picture of all the different things you've been doing. And I couldn't quite think of a job that would quite give me that breadth, actually. And that's one of the reasons that I love it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I feel like what you said about like, it's not just teaching, you do your own research and you get to speak to journalists and more, especially in a field like politics or anthropology. There's so much you have to interact with society, if you're going to do social sciences. Um, and there's this stereotype of academics being in their own little bubble and, making their research in their own little bubble. And do you feel like in the coming 20, 30 years, obviously like jobs evolve, do you feel like more of academics will be, I don't know how to phrase this, but engaging with the public on what they produce so that the research, because now there's like, because of social media, the internet, there's so much more scope for reaching a broader audience. Like 30 years ago, if you had your research, you probably couldn't reach these many people with, lifetime. But now you can. And do you feel like in 30 years, academics is going to evolve to have more engagement with a broader audience?
That's a really great question, because my gut reaction is that the avenues for doing so, exactly as you said, have changed. But in many ways, for the last few decades, this is kind of what academics have been doing. But it's hard to tell that story. And we don't necessarily need to all the time, because we're not too touchy about it or anything like that. But the reality is, I think that academics do all these broad things. But understandably, the majority of people wouldn't see that, because understandably, if their only interaction with the university is as a student, perhaps. And so they are there as a student and they're learning from the academic as a tutor, and they're not necessarily involved in the research dimension. And so that's a really understandable interpretation of what academia is. But I think over time, perhaps it's going to, through the avenues you mentioned, Twitter, etc., people start to understand how broad the job of being an academic is. And certainly the specialisms within there. I mean, I love teaching within lecture theatre more than I enjoy appearing on the news, say. And so individuals will have different preferences that mean that they have different focal points. And then as a result, they might specialise, or they may do other areas less. And that's inevitable. When you're busy, you've got lots and lots of different competing demands. So I think to a degree, everyone's a bit different. But I think almost all academics would do the breadth that I've been talking about. And that's one of the great things about it. That's why I'd recommend it, regardless of which, say, BAS specialism you choose to go down, you're going to have that breadth. And that's one of the joys and fulfilling yet exhausting parts of the job, I think.
I love that you mentioned academic Twitter, because I love academic Twitter, even though everyone there is like mostly miserable all the time. Like they're always tweeting about like, it's really interesting because on one side, it really does democratize knowledge. Like it's very hard to have like one-on-one conversations with anthropologists. Like I don't know that many, and I'm 19. I live in Bombay, but on academic Twitter, people make like these like small Twitter threads about what they're researching and how that's affecting the community, and it's so accessible and it's done so well. And I think it's really beautiful because it builds up your knowledge. Like a lot of the threads are actually pretty like compact, punched with knowledge. And I enjoy reading them. But on the other hand, they're always complaining about the workload in grad school. And I think one thing that I've noticed is, so I think there was a grad school admission cycle in the US recently that just wrapped up. And a lot of people were talking about like their acceptances, their rejections. And now that I'm in like my second year of a 4-year undergrad degree, I feel like I'm basically useless because they spoke about how they have like so many publications at undergrad, and that's how they got into grad school, and how you need to publish at undergrad, or how you need to do like so much research. And I was like, I didn't know you had to do that. Like you come in your first year, and it's a 3-year degree. You come in your first year, you're lost till your second year. You start to gain some grounding, and then by then it seems like it's too late to consider grad school. Because so I'm just curious, what advice would you give to undergrads, how you can prepare yourself? Because right now it seems like I've missed the boat.
No, absolutely not. I can't emphasize strongly enough how great you're already doing, Ananya. So I really wouldn't be concerned in the slightest there. A couple of points, because you've raised some key issues within academia there. Firstly, in terms of Twitter, it's a great resource. It absolutely is. And sometimes you will get some really good threads that neatly outline everything you need to know about aviation in climate policy. But one of the challenges is that when there's a lot of academics in a critical space and they're facing the same kind of challenges across countries, they're going to share these issues. And unfortunately, in line with many sectors around the world, the hours are getting longer and the pay as a ratio is going down. And I mean this as a comment on the forces we're seeing throughout capitalist societies. And so the outcome is that people need an avenue to say these things, and rightly so, and need to raise awareness. But simultaneously, there's a challenge in terms of supporting the next generation. There's also the dynamic around what is expected at certain stages of grad school. So I know, for example, applying for a PhD at certain universities in the US with full funding is starting to have some norms based around it, around certain bits of experience with research. And that is starting to happen. But certainly the reality that I've always seen and have experienced is that we're looking, if you want to go into grad school, for someone who's committed and passionate about their topic and has shown that they can get some really good marks. Like, I won't pretend that we're not fussy about marks, because that is something that we do have to bear in mind towards PhD places, particularly with funding, because with funding, we're talking about thousands and thousands of pounds being given to this person. So it's an investment in them. But when I was applying for my master's and my PhD, and I was very fortunate to get both funded, I got some good marks, absolutely. But I had never done an internship. I had never been involved in research in any meaningful way. My summer jobs were just working in a call centre, making sure that, in one case, pubs had enough pint glasses. And my job was to ring them up and see if they had enough pint glasses. And if they said yes, then I'd say, right, well, have a nice day, bye. And it wasn't a scam kind of thing. It was literally, I was the pint glass distributor for pubs, basically. So this was not a fruitful bit of experience for me in terms of being a researcher, but actually it was useful for me to constantly speak to people, which again is handy for being an academic, as I was just saying. So I would not say at all that you need to have lots and lots of different types of experience when applying for these things. You do need to have a passion for your subject. If you're wanting to go on to grad school, the higher the marks in many ways, the better, sure. But also we do look out for things like your involvement in societies and the things you've been involved in. That one of the most transformative experiences of my entire life was me and my two friends hitchhiking to Estonia for charity in second year. And I know the context is really different right now for you guys in the pandemic, and hopefully some of those avenues are going to start to become available again. But certainly if you're able to show some of those extracurricular and interpersonal dimensions, then that's fantastic. But there's no need to be intimidated by the workload at master's level. There's no need to feel like you'll not even get in if you are passionate about a thing and you're able to show that you're hardworking with it. So yes, use Twitter as you are doing for learning and getting a close connection with people. But there's a danger that people rule themselves out of things before they even see the great potential that they have. And I'd hate for that to be the case with you or anyone else on the course.
True, I agree. I think I use Twitter for, I like that you phrased it as productive, but my Twitter use is much more unhinged than that. I think those are all of my questions, but I think just any concluding thoughts that you have about, just your journey so far and reflecting on your life as an academic, as a political scientist, and or any questions you have for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great point. Why was it that you wanted to interview an academic about some of these things? Was there an aspect of this that you were hoping to find out about, or is there something there that motivates you for hearing about these things?
Okay, so that's a good question. So most of my anthropology friends make a lot of fun of me because I kind of shilled is what that's the word they use. We don't have that word in India, but I was introduced to the word shill. Apparently, that means when you sell out to the corporate world. And
It's not something I'm particularly familiar with as a phrase. No, no.
oh, okay, so basically
I'd like
that
to
it's
learn.
used to describe students who sell out to the corporate world. So in my first year, I knew I enjoyed anthropology a lot. I just picked politics because on UCAS, I just clicked it. So I accidentally went into BAS. Good serendipity there, but I was mostly looking for an anthropology degree. And in my first year, I found that there was nothing to do with regards to anthropology. I managed to do something on my own. My tutors were very helpful, but there was really nothing you could do as a first year undergrad to explore the field in, say, a CV building manner. So, to get some experience in academia, that was practically impossible. So I ended up applying to banks and consulting firms, and that my anthropology friends made a lot of fun of me. And after I did the work experience at these big banks and trading firms, I realized that I hated it. And I enjoyed social sciences, and I wanted to find a way to, I had nobody to talk to about it because, like I said, I don't really know anybody. And when I got the mail that, do you want to interview an academic about like their research? And I was like, yes, yes, I do. And I would love to learn about, how they got true to academia. Because if you read academic Twitter and if that's all you read, you'll feel like everybody has 75 publications and their life and they're all like tenure track at 30. So yeah, I think that's why I did it, because I was sick of applying to banks and I wanted to do something. I wanted to see how I could set myself to a researchy path instead.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of different pathways that are open to you, to be honest, because this is what's great about your degree. It's giving you that broad experience, and simultaneously, you're quite open to a lot of different things as well. Handily, whilst you were making these points, it really got me thinking about what would I wish to tell you about becoming an academic in that case, because it sounds like you're open to the idea, and I'm sure lots of people watching this are too. And it would be wrong to suggest that X job isn't competitive, so academia isn't competitive. But if you look at some of the data about apprenticeships, that is competitive. If you look at the data on getting to the University of Manchester, it's competitive. And so you're already on the right path to doing some of these jobs. And I don't want to give the false impression that once you're on that path, you'll path dependently get the job and it'll all be absolutely fine, because there are obstacles there. And it's important not to kind of paper over the cracks and pretend that that's not the case, when it can be very competitive to get a job, particularly in a certain location. One of the challenges with academia is my wife and I are both academics, and we want to live near each other, preferably in the same house, and we're very fortunate that we do. But the reality is, therefore, there's only X number of universities within, say, a 30-mile radius, and I don't live in Manchester. And so during the normal times, I was commuting to Manchester and back every time I had to have meetings. And so there are difficulties there with being an academic that are worth mentioning. There are other dimensions that, of course, you're aware of in terms of the pension issue that academics have been very concerned by. We are not earning as much as we were in terms of real terms 10 years ago, and pensions aren't as strong as they were. And we are not as well paid in our, say, 20s and 30s as we otherwise would be if we'd have gone on to these grad jobs. And so there are compromises, shall we say, or challenges that make the job particularly difficult. And it's important not to pretend those aren't there. but it's also important to make sure that we have the best people coming along. And we want, particularly in, say, climate policy, to have the best minds coming forward to make research happen. And so we do need the job to be as appealing as possible. That doesn't mean pretending it's different. It just means making the job as good as possible. And hopefully, if you decide that academia is for you, then you'll go for it and feel like you're supported along the way, because that's certainly what I would hope to be the case. That sure, it's competitive, but at least if you decide it's for you, you have voices and allies and support networks that will help you along the way.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, everything is competitive. So, and at every stage, like, say, getting into a master's is competitive. And once you've passed that hurdle, a PhD after a PhD, a tenure track. So there'll always be, the next big thing. And there's really no career path without its own share of obstacles. Yeah, I think the only thing about academia is that I think it's slightly harder to find more about than, the inbuilt ways that are like almost like unsaid rules about things you're supposed to be doing. And I think conversations like these are a good starting point. So you know where to, go. And yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you for talking to me.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Ananya. Thank you.
Thank you both.